The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and this week is our Week in Review edition, so that means I've got my two best friends here with me, Managing Editor Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg. A very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
And from the beautiful island of Mauritius, Geraud Neema. Bonjour, our Francophone editor.
Bonjour and good afternoon to you too.
Well, it's great to have you both here today because there's a lot to talk about and not a lot in Africa this week in the China-Africa space, in part because a lot of the news was very quiet around this space because there was a lot going on in Beijing. And this, of course, for many of you who follow China news, you've heard a lot about the 20th Party Congress that's been underway for the past 4 or 5 days now. The highlight of the event came on Sunday, when Chinese President Xi Jinping gave his big address. Now, I was thinking of laying out some of the key themes and playing sound bites of the address, but there's been so much talk about this. If you haven't followed it, I really recommend that you just kind of Google Xi Jinping, and that's all that will come up, and you'll see the key points. Today, what we want to talk about is what's the impact on Africa, the global south, and what it means in terms of the future direction for Chinese foreign policy writ large. I wrote a few things this week that caused quite a bit of discussion. Both Cobus and Geraud were interviewed by the press, including the BBC. We'd like to kind of find out what you told those folks. Let's start with you, Geraud, because this was something that you followed very, very closely. What was your hot take on Xi Jinping's 20th Party Congress speech and what the impact is on Africa?
Eric, my take on that was the fact that, first of all, he did not really mention the global south that much. It was more into Chinese policy, internal policy. So it was not really something we could expect that he was going to mention the global south, namely. He mentioned about the international order in general. The only international order where he put emphasis was on Taiwan, of course. That was quite expected. But in terms of global south, we did not see that much and we did not really expect that much. We can only make inferences based on what was said and how the internal politics in China is going to move. So from there, we can assume that China may move in a certain direction toward, in a certain type of direction toward Africa or not. So from that, it was not really, we didn't really have much to chew on. Now we have to wait on what's really going to happen when policies are going to be put in place.
Yeah, so you're right that this is not a speech that is normally one that is about foreign policy and that is about China's role in the world. This is very much a domestic speech. And in many ways, for our American listeners, I kind of equate it as a combination of the State of the Union address, where the president every year gets up in front of Congress and says, the state of our union is strong, and then goes through a litany of all the accomplishments that the president made in that previous year. Xi did the same thing. He went through all of the lists. He justified all of his policies, all of the reforms, all of the changes. So he talked about COVID-0. He talked about Taiwan. He talked about militarization. He talked about fortifying their supply chains, particularly in tech. So this was a lot about the U.S. This was a lot about Taiwan, as Geraud noted. But it was also like a convention speech at one of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party where they nominate their guy and they say, he's the guy we're going to do. Now, this is where it's very interesting, Cobus, because he is a norm breaker here. So normally, under law that was created in China after Deng Xiaoping did this actually, where they wanted to avoid a dictator for life. And so they created term limits where a Chinese president could be a president in office for 5 years and then another 5 years. And at that point, he's out of there. And they lived to that for 20 years, 20 plus years. Xi Jinping has now broken that. It doesn't seem to bother many people in Africa on the governance issues. At the end of the day, Cobus, what was your take on the speech, the reactions to it, the discussion or the lack of discussion in Africa about what happened?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think the lack of discussion is maybe not so surprising, considering how abstruse a lot of the kind of discourse is. You know, for those people who want to really kind of get a taste of the vibe, Bloomberg posted a full translation of the speech, and it is pages after pages. Like I think I was reading through it like for about 2 hours. You know, so it's definitely interesting. But as you say, like the focus is very domestic. The vibe you get is that for unlike earlier Chinese leaders, she obviously, as everyone knows, she is a national security politician. Kind of like is very security minded and is very focused on national security and on kind of enforcing the borders and such kind of like hard security issues. But what is interesting is that it seems like growth goals have been slightly tempered in order to fit into national security. So it seems like a kind of a dual focus on on hard security and economic security, and with it then a strong focus also on food security. So that was an interesting one for me. That there's some focus on food security and environmental security, kind of in the full speech. I think another thing that as Geraud mentioned, zero COVID is front and center, and they are leaning in, they're doubling down on it. So there wasn't even any kind of acknowledgement that it was a painful process or anything. It was simply framed as a full-on success. And so that's interesting. I think that's an indicator to African commodities producers that the kind of shutdowns and disruptions in Chinese manufacturing, which has been tough, I think, on a lot of African exporters of primary commodities, they're in place for a while. They're going to be there. And then it was also interesting for me that the BRI seemed to be de-emphasized. Like he didn't mention the BRI very often. I think only like it's one little section focusing on it, and it was immediately kind of folded into the Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative. So it does seem like, as people have predicted, those two seem to be the kind of BRI 2.0, and the actual the infrastructure heavy kind of aspect of the BRI seems to be receding.
Let me give you a couple takes. One from one of our good friends, Yuan Sun, who's the director of the China program at Stimson Center, and then my hot take. And then I'd like to get your reactions to both. Yuan Sun, who is really one of the sharpest observers and China watchers out there, really had a very interesting take. And she said effectively that this was a very populist speech. In many ways, and she didn't say this, these are my words, this is a speech that Donald Trump could have given. Because what he's basically saying is that the world is crazy out there, there's a lot of threats against us, and only I can solve it. And the party is the solution to all of the problems out there. So it was a very populist speech in that sense. And I thought that was a very interesting take. Here was the take that I took that did provoke a little bit of response. I got quite a few emails, including some from some African governments who didn't take well to my statements. But I said basically that this was a speech that indicated China's going to harden its positions. It's going to focus now much more on the great power competition. The priorities now are in the near abroad, so Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South China Sea, Taiwan. He was very clear that he's going to focus on militarization, and he's going to focus on the coming potential conflict with the United States. That said to me, and Cobus, this is picking up on what you talked about in terms of not mentioning the BRI, not mentioning really the global South. And again, we didn't expect a lot about the developing world, as Geraud pointed out. That's not the nature of this speech. But in the past, there have been a few nods to China's role as the leader of the developing world, that G77, that Banyong kind of moment. None of that. And so my take on this was that Africa has got to up its game if it wants to deal with China. And this means that Africans have got to change the way that they engage with China. For 25 years now, close to 25 years, China has been active and present in Africa. And all three of us, I think, will agree that in those 25 years, the China literacy, and Cobus, as you wrote, the capacity about China has not really improved dramatically. And that's going to make things much more difficult for African countries if they want to engage China that is now focused elsewhere. Africa just isn't the priority that it was if this speech was given 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Cobus, let me get your take, then Geraud.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You know, kind of Xi Jinping has other fish to fry at the moment. So this doesn't mean that necessarily that Africa business will fall off, or that African even investment flows will necessarily fall off, because a lot of those are driven not by the Chinese government, you know, but by other Chinese entities. But yeah, you know, kind of it's certainly a much less rosy kind of view of the outside world, and one where it's mostly focused on the outside world as a source of instability. And you know, you really do get a sense of people who are obsessed with order and very anxious about chaos. You know, and I think that's many people have made that point about Xi Jinping himself, but I think it's also true for Chinese politics. You know, there's a strong distaste for disorder, you know, kind of in Chinese politics. And you know, and I think the kind of the emergence of a lot of security challenges in Africa, for example, or you know, those kind of like the as you also see in some of these blockbuster movies that we've discussed in recent episodes, there's a strong framing of Africa as the source of disorder at the moment, you know, kind of in Chinese popular culture. So that's, you know, so that is an interesting kind of data point.
And consider a story that you wrote today in our newsletter about the urgent warning from the Chinese embassy in Nigeria for all Chinese nationals to evacuate from Kaduna State immediately because of marauding bandits who are looking to kidnap Chinese nationals. And then consider what that message was last December, I think it was, Geraud, where a similar message was ordered to Chinese nationals in the eastern DRC. And then we've had attacks on ethnic Chinese in South Africa, in Angola, and any number of places. That is a source of chaos, I think, that is permeating into the Chinese media that does not help Africa's position in the narrative that China sees Africa today. So, Geraud, what's your take?
Yes, my take on this, it's a bit what I even said on BBC earlier this week. It's the fact that, first of all, Africa will remain a political eye for China. China will keep on seeing Africa on a political perspective. Since you mentioned it in terms of global rivalry, great power rivalry, China needs foothold, it needs allies, and Africa will remain that place where China will keep on seeking approval, will keep on seeking ally, and we've seen that on Nancy Pelosi visits in Taiwan. We've seen that on Xinjiang votes last week on the Human Council in the United Nations. So in that perspective, yes, Africa will remain China ally. But as Cobus said, maybe we won't see a fall-off of Chinese business in Africa. We won't see that. But as we used to point out already this year, that we're going to see less than big infrastructure projects. I remember you made that comment a few days ago about Nigeria and how people came on to you about that situation, that, you know, China will not come back with those big investment and all. But yes, but China will remain on that political perspective, seeing Africa as a place where I can find ally. But the second perspective, still in this great power rivalry, is the fact that China, in terms of Africa, we also have natural resources in countries like Zimbabwe, DRC, and everything. Those countries will remain a center point for China, because we are talking about cobalt, lithium, those places where China wants to keep an edge. When we see restriction that the US is putting now on Chinese chips manufacture, on Chinese import, and all those issues, we kind of understand that new technology and strategic minerals will remain a center point for the decades to come for Chinese position in the global stage. So yeah, for that aspect especially, few countries in Africa will remain a central point for Chinese engagement on the continent.
I wanted to ask both of you what you think the impact of the superconductor ban coming from the Biden administration is going to be, particularly on China's messaging in the global south, because it was very interesting for me to see the size of and the scope of the ban and its implication, and then how little press it got. It got so little discussion, you know, and Edward Luce was.
Well, not in the U.S. it didn't. There was a lot in the U.S. So maybe in South Africa there wasn't, but there was a lot in the...
Yes, kind of in the rest of the world, yeah. Like Edward Luce was pointing out in FT that this is essentially like very close to like a commitment to regime change, you know, and what we've seen in the past is that in Africa and in South Africa particularly, a lot of government people are very, very sensitive, like super sensitive to any kind of like whisper of regime change. And, and so the ban is very interesting for me. And I've already seen some kind of Indian commentators on Twitter being like, oh, this is what the US is going to be doing to India in the 2030s. Where they immediately, where they're kind of framing it as this kind of containment of developing countries' development.
Be careful. That is actually Chinese propaganda that is filtering into India, saying they're doing it first to us and now they're going to come for you next. Okay, because India is part of the Quad.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think.
But that narrative still exists. That's the thing. That narrative exists. I've heard that from policymakers in Africa. That kind of and like, for example, the famous thing that Cyril Ramaphosa said. That the US is kind of cracking down on Huawei out of jealousy because of their advances. There's an established narrative in Africa.
But Cobus, that is not the case on superconductors, because the United States kicks ass on superconductors and semiconductors. I mean, so this is
no, of course. But you kind of, what I mean rather is the wider framing of the decision of the United States to hold back an entire economic sector in a foreign country. That's what I mean. Is kind of so I'm just wondering how that's going to play in the global South.
For me, I want to add something on that place where it's going to play in the global South, even though it's not really global South. But for me, it's how it's going to play with China and Taiwan relationship. Because when you talk about superconductor, we also have Taiwan in the mix.
Yes.
So with that kind of ban will somehow may impact the way China see its approach with Taiwan and how it's going to react to that. Because obviously, the ban is going to affect Chinese technology, and a lot of companies will be affected by that. But now, in the coming years, China will have to adjust to that. At this point, China doesn't have the technology yet to really, to move ahead without Taiwan. Is going to need it. So now, how China is going to react to that, to those bans, how it's going to adapt, and how long it's going to take it, that's a question we have to take into account.
So this was kind of the point that I was bringing up in my column, which is, stuff is getting real now, and the decoupling movement is serious. It's a real thing in the United States. There's a lot of segments of American business and government that are fed up and they want to go their own way. And let's be very clear here. This is not just the United States seeking to decouple from China. That is how the Chinese are positioning this. But that's complete and utter garbage. The Chinese have been decoupling from the United States for a very long time. Google, Microsoft, pick all the tech companies you want that have been kicked out of China. That is an effective decoupling as well. I know I'm going to get flack from people on that, but that is just the reality of what this is. Both have had enough in many respects. So here's where it comes down to, I disagree wholeheartedly with Luce. I don't think this is about regime change. I think a lot of people are coming out, even U.S. policymakers, and saying, yes, they do want to contain China's rise. Now, this is really, they do want to limit the ability of China to use American technology to further their economic and also their military advancement. I think they're upfront about that. But this goes back to the point that I'd like to ask you and that I raised in my column. We are approaching into a new era where we've never had a third term of a Chinese president who's now going to be president indefinitely. Xi Jinping now is freed up from the politics that he spent much of the past 5 years trying to negotiate this whole maneuver that he's done. He has spent an incredible amount of time trying to orchestrate what happened this week. Okay? He's liberated from that now. He's got, there you go, blue skies, off he goes. He can focus on this a lot more. The Americans are very serious. There is nothing that unites American politicians today more than China. I was watching the Val Demings, Marco Rubio senatorial debate in Florida this week. And these two disagreed on everything. But when it came to China, they were right on it with each other. So this is where I come for the global South. And I kind of say, you got to up your game. You got to figure out, where do you fit in this new world? What do you want from the United States? What do you want from China? Do you have the knowledge, the capacity, the understanding in order to leverage what maybe little power you have in these? Because these two powers now are not going to be focusing as much on places like Africa. It's that's my view. And I think, this is what I keep saying, you got to up your game. Cobus, you seem distraught by my comments.
No. Kind of. I was wondering while you were speaking whether them paying less attention to the global South is necessarily a bad thing for the global South.
That's right. It may not be the worst thing at all. It may not be the worst thing. It's bad in terms of being able to access some of the state capital, but it may be good that they're focused elsewhere. That is, you're right. That actually may be an upside for it.
But if they focus elsewhere, that's not a problem because for the global south. Because when you talk to many African decision makers and politicians, you have the feeling that they are not ready yet for that change. They always, and we've seen that all over the years, how they like themselves to play the China versus the West card. When it pleases them, we want to push that agenda. So since China and the US might be focused elsewhere, they might find themselves within no card to play. They might find themselves very at the end of the wagon and just not knowing how to push further. And this is going to be a problem for me because once the US and China lose interest in Africa, we may find ourselves in a huge void where everything can now happen at any time, and no one in Washington or in Beijing never done that anyway, but no one will be paying close attention to see what's happening there, why it's happening, how can we change it, how can we solve it, and China will be yeah, I've other priorities to move on to. But this is, for me, it can be a good thing and also be a bad thing. It's a bad thing if African politicians and decision makers are not ready for it, are not prepared for it. And I have the feeling that no one is prepared for it. They still have that feeling. And I'm just going to take you an example of a country like DRC. This week, we have the mining ministries of DRC who's been in Europe and in the US going and talking about how we need more Western mining companies back in the DRC. They went to the US saying the same thing. You have that feeling that, they still want to keep that China versus the West card and everything. But once we move from that place, it's going to be yeah, guys, you're on your own. Find a way to move forward with that.
Let me get your take on a column that was published this week in Business Day. That's a South African financial newspaper. And it was done by columnist Stephen Guo, who's also an adjunct senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. He's a regular commentator on South African business issues and speaks quite often on China-related issues. So he wrote, "What we in South Africa need to realize is that it is up to us to navigate the relationship with the Chinese. Beijing is generally favorably disposed towards the ANC-led South Africa, and Chinese businesses are keen to find opportunities here. Our business people also tend to be overtly West-facing and often ignore potential Chinese business opportunities." He goes on to say, the problem in South Africa, though, is the business climate is very, very resistant and very difficult for foreign investors. And then he concludes, China may be a threat to the West as the center of global trade, but this analysis does not necessarily apply to South Africa. Cobus, I felt a little bit vindicated after Stephen published that column because that very much was what I was saying as well, that you gotta figure this thing out. Cobus, do you remember when we interviewed the head of governance at Wits University? His name is escaping me. And he said something fascinating to us. He said, if there are 5 people in the South African Ministry of Trade that have China knowledge, he would be surprised. And I think that is just mind-bogglingly stupid at this 25 years into the Chinese presence in Africa.
Yeah, I don't have anything good to say about it. It's dumb. It's surprising for me how complacent African policymakers are. And also I think not only African policymakers, but I think a lot of South African business people. I was speaking with a business journalist, a South African business journalist yesterday, and she mentioned to me that she was speaking to a lot of mining executives in South Africa, and they were all like, oh, is like changes in Chinese manufacturing. Does that mean that the party's over? That we won't be able to export as much stuff to them? And I'm like, yeah, in the first place, you guys have been exporting raw mineral ore for decades and decades, right? Kind of with no seeming move to want to diversify that or move up the value chain or anything. And yet somehow it's surprising when the economy changes in China and they start making other arrangements. It's just, why aren't these people preparing? Why aren't they more proactive in terms of getting different kinds of Chinese deals, but also in preparing for things changing in China? I mean, did they expect things to go on like this forever? I mean, it's crazy.
Well, to be fair, and Joel, I'm going to get your take on this. I received some email from at least one African government who said, Eric, you're being a little too tough. There are some of us here who, studied in China. We speak Chinese. We're in the foreign ministries. We're trying to make a difference. I agree that it's not uniform. There are some amazing people doing some amazing things. But Geraud, you and I have spoken on a number of occasions. that said basically, you as a graduate of Renmin University, People's University in Beijing, you speak Chinese, you've spent 10 years in China, would never get a job in the Congolese Foreign Ministry. And that is the case for a number of Africans who have returned from China with university degrees, advanced degrees, speak the language fluently, have an enormous amount of skill in terms of managing relationships with China, but are not hired into the foreign ministries or even into many African companies because they don't have the right connections, they don't have the right family, they don't come from the right political group, tribe, clan, you name it, and they're marginalized. And all of that experience in China just goes to waste.
Exactly. They're just nowhere. They're just exactly nowhere because when you think of it, we are like almost 22, 25 years into where Chinese active engagement in Africa. We are almost 500,000 of African students who went to China from 2000 to 2020 to study, and they came back, graduate speaking Chinese, work with Chinese and everything. But when you look at the imprint, the impact on China-Africa relationship, you don't see it anywhere. You're all like, where are they? They're just gone, vanished. From the government perspective, when you talk to officials, you have the feeling that you guys were not just ready to you are not ready and prepared to take them back and to integrate them in your China-Africa engagement in a way that they're going to be asset for you. They keep on complaining. You have ambassadors African ambassador in Beijing who don't speak Chinese. You have diplomats negotiating with Chinese who don't speak. They have no knowledge at all about Chinese politics, Chinese culture, Chinese negotiation approach. It's just mind-boggling. You're like, guys, where were you? You have millions of people. You have thousands of students who are just willing, ready to come back and study and be with you, work with you. But guys, you're not just using them. And this is for me a place where you kind of wondering if we are really preparing seriously to understand China, or even if we had that willingness to engage China for what it is, instead of using it as a leverage to attract more Western investment. That's why we did not put much energy into knowing China for what it is and where it's going, what is trajectory, what is history, what is strategy. We don't care about it because we see China just as like a pawn to attract the US, to make the US jealous, to make the French jealous, to make the Belgium jealous, but not because for what China is itself.
And with that, then, that I think is so true, and it also raises all of these questions about the project of African development and industrialization itself, right? Because it's not like these are thriving kind of like groups of technocrats, with only where they somehow magically just don't have China capacity. They're not growing these kind of technocrat classes in relation to other things either. And which then raises a lot of questions about what African leaders actually want those jobs for, whether it's just a 21st century version of like old school, kind of extroversion, where they're essentially just gatekeepers to kind of control access to, to raw materials for a fee. It's like where are those technocrats when we need them? When Africa needs to have some kind of, for example, massive kind of green transition. For example, so I think it raises really key questions about the concept of African development itself, and not just in relation to China.
So, Geraud, you're going to actually do some research coming up on this about what happened to all of those African students who went to China, got these degrees, learned the culture, language, and history and whatnot, and when they came back to African countries, they just kind of vanished because, as you point out, there's been more than 500,000 students over the past 20 years who've studied in China, but you don't really feel like there's been a significant impact. That human resource doesn't feel like it's been leveraged. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing with this research project.
So with that research project, what am I going to look at? I'm going to look at the trajectory of those African alumni from China. What happened to them? After China, where did they go? And did they work with Chinese investment back home? Did they somehow, with the government or private sector, work with the Chinese? I would like to know what happened to them. Where did they go? Were they welcome when they came back? When they were offering the services, were they integrated into the foreign ministries or even into the government? I'm going to also be talking to African decision makers, especially foreign affairs ministry, to try to understand Did they have any strategy when they were sending those scholarships into China? Was there like any thought behind to say, we are sending that much and we're going to get that much? When they came back, did you use them, for example, in those big Chinese companies who are investing in Africa? Did you use them? Did you send them in there so they can alleviate any problem that we can have with Chinese companies? This is the goal I'm going to try to understand and see, and at the end, come up with the solution, not really a solution, but come up with a discussion with different decision makers to say, guys, we have to readjust because we cannot keep on doing it for the next 10, 20 years. China took advantage of sending its students to the US, to Europe. When they came back, they are now the hawks that we see in foreign affairs, we see in the Ministry of Economics, that those top diplomats who know exactly, they speak the language, they speak different language, they're really on top of the game. And we cannot keep on doing the same thing in Africa. There is a time where we have to say, guys, we have those Riemann resources. They speak Chinese. They know the language. They know the culture. They know the history, even though most of them are into the technical studies. But we still need to understand, we still need them to integrate them in our discussion with Chinese. Otherwise, we are keep on losing. Because for the Chinese themselves, they say, okay, for them, for those African students, we can use them as translator. Because when you see Chinese companies, most of them, when they use former African students from China, they use them as translator, between them. But even there, they keep on changing because now you're seeing more and more Chinese speaking French, speaking Yoruba, speaking English, and they use them to translate to the local government. They don't need those former African students anymore. So at the end, we have a bulk of students, people from China, they know that, but we're not just using them. And this is where my project is going to be. We're going to be talking with those students across Africa in different countries. We're going to see what happened to them, what did they do, and what's going to be next for them. And to decision makers, what was the strategy behind, if there was any strategy anyway.
I am so excited about this project because I've never seen anything about this before. Cobus, have you ever seen any research done on this before about what's happened?
No, not on this level, no.
No, I think this is a wide open space. So fantastic. This is something that we're really going to be interested to follow up and to hear about what you've been doing.
So that's why I hope that if there is if the association of former African students would like to take part of the project, to reach out, to have the discussion, I'd like really to interview them because we're going to have podcasts, we're going to have chat with them, we're going to have interviews. So it's going to be really interesting if they can reach out so we can talk more about that.
Well, I think a lot of students may want to talk because there's a lot of frustration in the student community in Africa because of the COVID-0 policies, where they were forced to study remotely for many years. Now they can't get back into the country. And so you might actually find a lot of pent-up frustration. And again, this era, and this is again a new era that we're in, the era of tens of thousands. Before pandemic, it was 62,000 African students every year who went to China. That's over now. The zero COVID has made that all but impossible. Getting into China, some students are going back, but it's a trickle. It's nowhere near what it was. And one has to wonder if that will ever go back to what it was. So again, we're possibly we're in uncharted territory here in many different ways. Guys, before we move on to a couple other quick topics, just before we end the show, I want to get your take on one of the propaganda videos. And one of the noticeable things about this 20th Party Congress that I saw was the media that was produced was much slicker. I mean, just orders of magnitude slicker than what we've seen in the past. Normally in the past, it was this kind of crappy CCTV styles, videos that just were really awkward. This time, though, it reminded me of what a U.S. political convention does. When the Democrats and the Republicans, they put, you remember back in the Clinton days, it was a man from hope. And it was this real kind of and then the Trump videos, which were like, bam. Well, the Chinese did a whole bunch of videos around Xi and then around the Communist Party. And I want to play one for you about the Communist Party, because I think this is the kind of message that would resonate in parts of Africa. Let's take a listen to, again, and I edited this a little bit to shrink it down. So anybody from the Chinese Communist Party who's going to get angry at me for editing this, I had to for the sake of time. So it's, who knows what I've unfurled here, but okay, let's take a listen now.
Who am I? I'm not a born leader. I was once so weak that only a few comrades were there for me. For me, everything did not always go smoothly. I have passed through adversity and made great sacrifices while marching ahead. I was not born to be invincible. All that I do is to keep dreaming and fighting.
我们党立志于中华民族千秋伟业，致力于人类和平与发展，崇高事业，责任无比重大，使命无上光荣。
My name is the Communist Party of China.
So, again, that was, if you didn't recognize the voice, that was Xi Jinping speaking there and basically saying, the Communist Party is the center of everything in China. But Cobus, there's one message in there that I thought would be interesting to get your take on, this idea that I was once weak and now I'm not anymore. And I think that is a message for a lot of people in places like Africa who feel forgotten, who feel trampled on, who feel that they don't get the attention and the respect that they deserve, to see a country that in our lifetime, barely in Geraud's lifetime, but Cobus, in your and my lifetime, was at the poverty level that some of Africa's poorest countries are at today. And today it is the power that it is. And I thought that's part of the propaganda narrative that China's used very successfully over the past 10 years, 15 years in places like Africa to say, we were poor, but we're not anymore.
Yeah, I think it's it's one of China's most effective tools. I think in the global South, in Africa particularly, it'll be interesting to hear African reactions to this media. That would be such a fun thing to play to a class of grad students, for example. It would be, and to just kind of get their reaction. But
what do you think they would say though? Try channel. You taught grad students this media. What do you think they would say?
It's, that's the thing with teaching them. It's they always surprise you. So I'm not 100% sure. I think some of them would definitely get a lot of resonance from, not only from the development itself, but also increasingly from the stability. I think that we see in China, and I think in South Africa, for example, though. So recently we spoke to Joseph Asunka, right, kind of the head of Afrobarometer, who does all of this polling around African countries, and one of the things they poll for is how excited people are about democracy. And in general, like a lot of young African people tend to be very pro-democracy. The one country where they have lost a lot of their enthusiasm for democracy is South Africa. Interestingly, South Africa is one African country where support for democracy has actually fallen, and a lot of it I think has to do with perceptions in South Africa that democracy is essentially just opened the door to just corruption, and there's been a lot of kind of like informal, not calls, but I've heard people say that, kind of if someone with backbone, if someone with a strong approach could just sort all this chaos out, that kind of, you get the feeling in South Africa that if someone could offer, order, and particularly public safety and more predictable or regular kind of water and electricity supplies, they would be able to get away with a lot, with being quite a hard, authoritarian turn. And that is something that I kind of...
But this is big man politics. This was one of the interesting things that during the Trump years, despite the fact that Trump denigrated places like Nigeria, he actually polled quite well in Nigeria because they definitely like the big man politics. Geraud, you come from a country where there is literally a big man who runs the country.
Sorry to interrupt you, Eric. I think I tend to see that as a misreading, because the thing is okay. So Trump is a wild card, and I don't think he necessarily he needs more unpacking, and kind of in the African context. But I think Africa is used to big man politics, right? I mean, Africa originated big man politics to a certain extent. But this is a system that actually delivers social goods. And there's the difference, because a lot of Africa has seen many kind of like big man-led governments who don't deliver anything. And I think and to a certain extent, democracy itself has been tainted through that process, because a lot of these big men are voted for. But in the end, like it comes.
Singapore model,
because it's that Singapore model. It's like we're willing to give up civil liberties in order to get stability and to get social goods and services.
Exactly. And talking about Singapore, you have that kind of model in Rwanda, where people say, Kagame took Rwanda from downgrade and take it up. And because he was a strong man, he built a very strong apparatus to control the country, to provide public goods, safety, development, and all that. And this is where, for me, I think that Chinese Congress and Xi Jinping third mandate can really resonate in many on the continent, because now that you have many political parties on the continent where they try to remove the term limit. It's been a trend that we've been seeing for many years. Now, when they were doing that, even developed country, U.S. ambassador, different ambassador would tell them that, China, the country that you like, even China has a term limit of two mandate. But now China has removed it. Many in Africa will be like, yes, we need that strong stability. We need that strong system. And Cobus, when I kind of a bit disagree with you, it's like, they're used to big men, but the big men with democratic system does not work. So when you take the big man system, combining with the Chinese system, they can say, yeah, that can provide public good. And I'm telling you, people are going to take Rwanda as an example to say, you look at Kagame, he does whatever he does, the way he does it, but he's delivering stability, safety, and whatever you want to say. So this is why I think that Chinese Congress, what Xi Jinping is doing right now, will slowly resonate in many African countries. And let's not forget that last year they inaugurated a leadership school in Eastern Africa, where they're going to be training six political parties in Africa, those like Zimbabwe, Angola, a place where we find a lot of strong China ties, where they're coming from, liberation army fighters and everything. So in those parties there, I won't be surprised that in the coming years that we're going to see a shift of politics, a shift based on how China is going to influence them, and to try to say, we are going to deliver stability, we are going to deliver development economic, we are going to deliver public goods. And with that context, I'm thinking that parties like ANC, they can take an opportunity to say, okay, I think we also need something like that in here.
Of course, there's a party training school also in South Africa. That party training school you're talking about is in Tanzania. And this, again, is not the Chinese state. Very important distinction here. This is the Communist Party of China that is running those training academies that's there. Let's get on to two final topics. Big news that happened this week. Number one, Cobus, the Transnet strikes are now over. So this was a drama that played out since, I think it was October 6th, that basically brought all rail and shipping out of South Africa to a grinding halt. This speaks a little bit to what Stephen Kuo was talking about in terms of the obstacles to doing business in South Africa. This has a very direct tie to China, because the Port of Durban in particular and the Port of Cape Town are major gateways for all of the stuff that comes from Geraud's home country in the DRC. It travels down the N1 highway into the Port of Durban. It's back again. What was the discussion in South Africa about the impact that this has on South Africa's role as a gateway for goods going to places like China, and the impact that this strike had?
I think South Africans are so used to these kind of cycles. There was certainly, worry raised about it in terms of kind of lost revenue and so on. But like South Africa has seen these kind of strikes before. It's a ritual in South African politics where the unions need to demonstrate their power. I think that they were pushed further than they usually were. I think because usually they would threaten a strike, but they wouldn't necessarily pull the trigger. In this case, I think they, kind of like the bottom line on the Transnet side and the kind of value of keeping those lines running probably made the employer side, kind of more resistant, which then pushed the unions into actually striking. But, South Africa isn't surprised by strikes.
Well, I think South Africa sometimes takes its role in the global economy for granted here, because Transnet had to declare force majeure on its shipping contracts for the third time in 18 months. That's a lot of blockages and stoppages that are going on. Here's the issue, though. Coming out of the DRC now, it's not only going to be South Africa that will be the gateway for it. So there are new railways and port systems being built in the port of Lobito in Angola, the Walvis Bay in Namibia. Tanzania now has its sights set on bringing all of that cobalt and copper and ore out of the DRC to the port of Dar es Salaam. When you look at this, Geraud, and you see everything, again, being blocked up, I think about the auto industry that is in desperate need for cobalt and for lithium. And when they see these shutdowns in places like South Africa, all they're going to do is send all of their MBAs to go and figure out new logistics routes to get that stuff out of the Congo so they can feed those battery factories and then make, all the Teslas that need those resources.
Yes, they're going to try. And I think that they're actually trying to do that now to find an alternative, because in 18 months, when you have 3 force majeures, and this one is not even the longest one. The longest one was like the one we had a few months ago. It was like, guys, there's just like too much. And without even mentioning the different flood that happened in South Africa. But they're going to be looking for opportunities. But I think this might be an opportunity for African countries, those producing countries, to say, hey, guys, instead of looking for opportunities the other way out from Africa, why don't you just build it inland here? And we see that trend now happening in Zimbabwe. People like we want those trends here. So I think what's happening in South Africa gonna upset many in China. But if African country plays their card well, they can also seize the opportunity to say, instead of looking another way out, let's just put it here in home.
So the Zimbabwe reference that Geraud made is very interesting. A consortium of Chinese companies signed a $2.8 billion deal to not only mine, but also process lithium. Here we are with the dream of moving up the value chain, and in all places, it's happening in Zimbabwe. So that is something very interesting. By the way, we have reached out to an Indonesian mining expert to come on the show. Indonesia has done an excellent job in terms of forcing companies, especially Chinese companies, to process nickel domestically, and we think there might be some good examples there in terms of what African countries are trying to do. Cobus, last topic on the agenda today before we take off, and that was Chinese Ambassador Zhou Pingjian in Nairobi met for the second time with newly elected President William Ruto. And this was a very big week for China-Kenya relations. There's a lot at stake on this. Earlier in the week, we saw that, again, the Kenyan government denied this, but they never offered up any proof to the contrary to prove otherwise. Business Daily newspaper published a photo of a $10.8 million fine implemented by the China Exim Bank for effectively a default on the standard gauge railway loan. At the same time, then, in the parliamentary, it's the confirmation hearings for the new cabinet, the new road and transport minister said that they are going to ask for a 5-year repayment holiday from the Chinese on those loans. Again, no indication that the Chinese will do it. A lot of activity in the China-Kenya space. What was your take, Cobus, this week?
Yeah, they're all very interesting kind of data points. It is very interesting to see how the new government is engaging with all of these commitments set up by their predecessors. Like, there was a lot of criticism in these confirmation hearings about the specific deals made by the Kenyatta government, and also a commitment to publish the contract of the standard gauge railway, which would be a major event if it actually is published. And so I think all of this is just is kind of interesting kind of indicators of tactics that Kenya's trying to remain liquid while dealing with a growing debt crisis. And I think it's still also going to be very interesting to see, because Kenya entered this 38-month long IMF process, kind of a stabilization process, earlier this year. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that then plays into all of these commitments to repaying the Chinese and all of the other creditors involved in Kenya.
I thought it was interesting in the transport minister's parliamentary confirmation hearings that he threw some shade on the Nairobi Expressway, because this is not what we've heard from the Kenyan government up until now. And he basically said, this thing isn't viable. We didn't like the procurement process. I mean, he basically said it was a lot like some of the other deals. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, the Kenyan Auditor General also this week, also published in Business Daily, revealed that a $175 million fiber optic loan, that is a loan to build a fiber optic network in Kenya, she wasn't able to audit it. And she said there were a lot of irregularities with the China Exim Bank. There was not an open bidding process. And it just feels like, oh my God, here we go again, that things just don't seem to be improving in Kenya when it comes to these procurement issues. And even though all of these procurement issues are on the books, it's against the law to do so much of what they're doing, and yet it keeps happening again. Geraud, we're out of time. I'm going to give you the last word on Kenya and the week that we've had.
So on Kenya, there's nothing much to say from my side. So simply that, we're going to have an interesting story to see what's going to happen. There, for me, it's more into see how Ruto is going to move to China, because he was a bit hard he had hard stance. The Ruto candidate seems to be a different Ruto as president when he's now engaging with China. Let's see how maybe he had his Michael Sata experience. Now he's gonna catch up with real politics, and let's see how it's gonna end. How he's going to deal with that. So for the rest of the week, we keep on working on providing news about what China is doing in Africa, and we have some interesting stories and that we are covering on our French website and English website. So not really big stories this week, but you're gonna find some quite interesting stories to read on our website. And we have also our bi-weekly newsletter, so coming out every Tuesday and Friday. When you have the time, go check it out and subscribe. You're gonna be really happy about the content that we're providing.
So you can subscribe right at the top of the Projet Afrique Chine. If you didn't get that website, it's in the show notes, and you will be able to sign up for Geraud's excellent newsletter. Again, if you speak French, we also offer it in Arabic. Our Arabic editor, Nesrine Kamal, is doing a fantastic job on that one. She's doing a weekly Arabic language newsletter and also a podcast as well. So very exciting there. And finally, I want to give a very big welcome to the community at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, who are our newest subscribers to the China Global South Project. So anybody who is a faculty or a community member at SOAS, you can now access us. If you would like to see what the folks at SOAS are reading, and at about 25 different governments around the world and thousands of subscribers, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and you'll see that all the options are there. It's super cheap. But again, we speak to this issue. Gentlemen, this is what we do. We've been speaking to this issue of China knowledge, China literacy, and China capacity. There's no shortcut to figuring out how to get ahead on this. The only way you do it is by reading, and more reading. And we are just one great place to make that easier for you. Cobus writes 2 days a week. I write 2 days a week. And then Geraud, Nesrine, and our entire team kind of feed in and contribute into that. So it's a great, great effort from folks in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Last piece of log rolling. Geraud, you are the community manager for our Patreon community at patreon.com/China Africa Project. Tell everybody what we're doing over there.
So in our Patreon community, we provide weekly videos and digests about what we do in China Africa. We also provide a one-to-one conversation for our top tier members. If you really want to have this monthly one-to-one conversation with us, having insights, having a moment to talk with us, just come and join us. We're going to be really happy to have you in our Patreon community. And I really want to thank our Patreon community. It's a community that keeps on growing. People keeps on trusting us. And I'm really grateful about what they do, what they provide, and I would like to engage with them much more and more in the future. So if you really like what we do in terms of our content, in terms of what we cover in China, Africa, and China Global South, come and join our Patreon. You can help us keep on being that independent news that's covering China and Africa, China in the Global South.
It's so important. Once again, patreon.com/China Africa Project, and you will also get, for our top tier members, don't forget, you get some swag. You get a mug. That is very cool. People have sent us pictures of their mugs, or on their desks around the world.
Yes,
I think that is so cool.
Yeah.
So, okay, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We're getting some really great feedback on these week in review shows. In fact, we're also going to start something new, maybe in November. where we're going to, Cobus, this is very scary. This is very, very scary. You and I have faces for radio, and we're going to start putting these shows up on YouTube and trying to reach a larger audience.
Ooh, I'm finally getting that Botox I was planning.
That's right. I am terrified. I mean, I am really, really terrified. But there's so many great podcasts now up on YouTube, and there's such a great energy with this group. And we're going to get Nesreen to join us as well. And we've got our editor, Kevin, in Nairobi, who's going to put all this magic together. So watch out for that on our YouTube channel. We're really going to start doing some new things on our YouTube channel, and we'll put the links for that also in the show notes. Okay, let's leave it there. Cobus, Geraud, and I will be back again maybe next week, definitely the week after. Geraud will see you, obviously, on the French site. And until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.